Write in the comments which country you're watching from and which sultan fascinates you the most. If you're interested in the hidden stories of the Ottoman Empire, subscribe to the channel. In the frozen winter of 1638, a sultan stands before the walls of a legendary city, Baghdad. For 15 years, it has defied his empire. Inside his tent, the ghosts of his executed brothers whisper warnings. Outside, 100,000 soldiers await his command. This is not just a battle for a city. It is a war against his own demons. This is the story of Murad IV, the Iron Sultan, and his bloody quest to forge an empire from the ashes of anarchy. The year is 1623. Within the silent, perfumed halls of the Topkapi Palace, a whisper can be more lethal than a blade. The Ottoman Empire, a titan straddling 3 continents, is sick at its heart. Its last true ruler, the young and ambitious Osman II, had been betrayed, humiliated, and strangled by his own elite Janissary soldiers just a year prior. His crime? Daring to dream of reform. In his place, the throne was briefly occupied by the mentally feeble Mustafa I, a pawn in a game he could not comprehend, twice enthroned and twice deposed. Into this cauldron of paranoia, betrayal, and decay, a child is thrust. He is 11 years old. His name is Murad. He is the son of the murdered Sultan Ahmed I and the formidable Kösem Sultan, a woman of immense political skill and ruthless ambition. As Murad is guided to the golden throne, the weight of the imperial turban seems to crush his small frame. He is not a ruler, he is a symbol, a placeholder in a state run by others. His mother, Kösem, will rule as regent, the first woman to officially do so in the empire's history. But she is not alone in the shadows. Around the boy sultan circle the true powers of the realm. The rebellious Janissary Agas who made and unmade his predecessors, the scheming viziers who saw the state as their personal treasury, the palace eunuchs who traded in secrets and poison. Every bow is a potential threat, every smile a mask for ambition. Murad learns his first lesson not from tutors of statecraft, but from the chilling silence that followed his uncle's murder. He learns that power is not given. It is a raw, bloody thing that must be seized and held with an iron grip. For now, he is a prisoner of his own inheritance, a boy seated upon a throne of vipers, watching, listening, and nursing a cold, silent understanding of the violent world he has been born to command. With a child on the throne and his mother ruling as regent, the sinews of the Ottoman state began to fray. The decade that followed Murad's accession was not a reign, but a slow-motion collapse. The authority of the Sultan, once absolute, became a commodity to be bartered and sold. In the capital, Istanbul, the Janissaries and the Sipahi cavalry, the very pillars of Ottoman military might, turned on each other and the state. They were no longer soldiers, but armed political factions who stormed the palace gates with impunity, demanding promotions, gold, and the heads of officials they disliked. Grand viziers were appointed and dismissed with dizzying speed, many ending their short tenures at the end of a rope, their wealth confiscated to temporarily placate the insatiable greed of the soldiery. Across the vast empire, the chaos radiated outwards. Governors in Anatolia and the Balkans raised the banner of rebellion, ruling their provinces as personal fiefdoms. The imperial treasury, drained by corruption and military mutinies, ran dry. The state was bankrupt, its administration paralyzed. And on the eastern frontier, the empire's great rival, Safavid Persia, under the brilliant Shah Abbas the Great, saw its opportunity. In 1624, a year into Murad's reign, the unthinkable happened. Baghdad, the ancient capital of the Abbasid caliphs, a jewel of the Sunni world and a city conquered by the legendary Suleiman the Magnificent, fell to the Shia Safavids. The loss was a catastrophic blow to Ottoman prestige and a deep personal humiliation. From his gilded cage in the Topkapi, the young Murad watched as his inheritance was squandered, his armies mutinied, and his most sacred cities were lost. He was a powerless spectator to the dismemberment of his own empire, a fire of helpless rage building within him with every report of failure and defeat. For 9 long years, Murad had been a ghost in his own palace, a puppet whose strings were pulled by his mother and her revolving door of corrupt viziers. But in 1632, the simmering anarchy boiled over, and in the crucible of terror, the boy died and the Sultan was born. He was now 20 years old. The Sipahi cavalry, enraged over late payments and the rise of rival factions, stormed the grounds of the Topkapi Palace. They were a roaring mob, brandishing swords and demanding the heads of 17 of the Sultan's closest officials, including his Grand Vizier, his Grand Mufti, and his childhood friend. For 3 days, the palace was under siege. Murad and his mother, Kösem, tried to negotiate, to placate, but the rebels were implacable. They breached the second gate, their roars for blood echoing through the sacred courtyards. Finally, cornered and with no other choice, Murad was forced to surrender his men. One by one, they were handed over. He was forced to watch from a high window as his loyal Grand Vizier, Hafiz Ahmed Pasha, a man who had tried to protect him, was torn to pieces by the mob right below. They stabbed him, desecrated his body, and left him in the dirt. In that moment, something inside Murad shattered and reformed into something harder than steel. The humiliation, the helplessness, the sight of his loyal servant's butchery, it forged an unbreakable resolve. Historians say he did not speak for days. He locked himself away, but he was not grieving. He was plotting. He had seen the true face of the anarchy that had consumed his empire. He understood that to save it, he could not be a ruler. He had to be a cleansing fire. In the cold silence of his chambers, surrounded by the ghosts of the men he could not save, Murad IV made a blood oath to himself. He would reclaim his authority, he would purge the state of every traitor, and he would personally drench the soil of his empire with the blood of those who had defied him. The era of the regency was over. The reign of Murad the Ruthless had begun. The Sultan's vengeance was not swift, but methodical, cold, and absolute. Having secured the loyalty of a new Grand Vizier and a corps of devoted commanders, Murad began to dismantle the architecture of rebellion that had defined his youth. He started with its nerve centers, the coffee houses of Istanbul. These were not mere cafes, they were hubs of political dissent, where Janissaries and disgruntled citizens would gather to gossip, plot, and rail against the state. In 1633, Murad banned them entirely, along with tobacco and wine, on pain of death. This was not a moral crusade. It was a political masterstroke, severing the lines of communication for his enemies. To enforce his will, Murad revived a terrifying tradition, the Sultan as public executioner. He would roam the streets of his capital at night, disguised as a commoner, listening for any word of dissent. A man caught smoking, a soldier complaining about his pay, Murad himself would reveal his identity and cut the offender down on the spot. Fear, stark and primal, descended upon Istanbul like a shroud. The city that had once echoed with the roars of mutiny fell silent. Next, he turned his attention to the military barracks. He summoned the Sipahi leaders responsible for the 1632 uprising and had them strangled one by one. He conducted a brutal purge of the Janissary corps, executing thousands suspected of disloyalty. He showed no mercy, not even to the highest echelons. He executed his own brother-in-law, the governor of Egypt, for corruption. He had a Grand Mufti, the highest religious authority in the empire, exiled and executed for challenging his authority. Within a few short years, the state was transformed. The treasury was refilled with confiscated wealth, the army was disciplined by terror, and the Sultan's word was once again law. The vipers that had coiled around his throne were either dead or hiding in fear. The anarchy was over, replaced by an iron-fisted autocracy. Now, with his home silenced and his power absolute, Murad could finally turn his gaze east, toward the city whose loss had haunted his childhood. Baghdad. For 13 long years, the Ottoman Empire was not ruled by a sultan, but by a sultana. From the gilded confines of the harem, Kösem Sultan, the valide, held the strings of power, her son Murad, but a boy on a throne too large for him. She was a master of the political game, her network of spies and loyalists a web spun across the vast empire. But while she governed, the boy watched. He grew into a young man of formidable size and simmering rage. His muscles coiled with a strength that mirrored the volcanic fury building within him. He saw the corruption, the weakness, the Janissaries who had become kingmakers, their arrogance an open wound on the honor of his dynasty. The breaking point arrived in 1632. The Janissaries, emboldened by years of unchecked power, stormed the gates of the Topkapi Palace. They swarmed into the second courtyard, their swords drawn, their voices a roar of insurrection. They demanded the heads of 17 of the Sultan's closest advisers and friends, including his Grand Vizier. The young Murad, not yet 20, was forced to stand before the mob. He pleaded, he bargained, but they were deaf to his authority. In a moment of ultimate humiliation, he was forced to surrender his loyal men to their blades, watching as they were cut down before his very eyes. That moment of impotence forged a will of iron. The boy died, and a tyrant was born. In the months that followed, a terrifying quiet fell over Istanbul. Murad began his purge. He did not delegate, he often acted himself. Disloyal officers, corrupt judges, rebellious sipahis, they began to disappear. He would summon a pasha to the palace, and the man would never be seen again. He strangled the new Grand Vizier with his own hands. He solidified his grip on the army, instilling a discipline born of absolute terror. And he turned to his mother. He did not harm her, but he stripped her of her political authority, moving her allies and dismantling her network. He made it clear that the regency was over. The shadow of the Valid Sultan was finally eclipsed by the dark, furious reign of her son. The empire now had a master. In the Ottoman court, brotherly love was a luxury no prince could afford. The law of fratricide, established by Mehmed the Conqueror, was a brutal but effective tool to prevent the devastating civil wars that had plagued the empire's early history. For a sultan, a brother was not family. He was a rival in waiting, a potential figurehead for every disgruntled faction in the realm. Sultan Murad IV had grown up with his half-brothers in the gilded cage of the cafes. He knew them, played with them, but always the specter of the throne stood between them. Of all his brothers, Prince Bayezid was the most dangerous. He was handsome, popular with the soldiers, and possessed a charisma that Murad, with his grim and fearsome demeanor, lacked. As Murad prepared to march east, the thought of leaving such a potent rival in the capital was an intolerable risk. The final catalyst, as legend tells it, came during a game of javelin. In the palace gardens, the brothers competed. Bayezid, a skilled horseman and warrior in his own right, outthrew the Sultan. It was a minor victory in a meaningless game, but to Murad's paranoid mind, it was an act of supreme arrogance, a challenge to his authority. He saw in his brother's success the seeds of rebellion. The decision was made. There was no trial, no public announcement. On a cold day in 1635, as the army prepared for the Revan campaign, the palace's deaf-mute executioners were summoned. They entered Bayezid's chambers and did their silent, terrible work with a silk bowstring. The act was more than political calculation. It was a profound psychological threshold. In killing his brother, Murad severed one of his last remaining personal bonds. He was now truly alone on the summit of power, isolated by the blood he had spilled to secure his throne. The deed hardened him, erasing any lingering softness and leaving only the cold resolve of a monarch who would sacrifice anyone, even his own kin, for the sake of the state. The palace was silent, but the path to Baghdad was now clear. With the home front pacified by terror and the succession secured by fratricide, Sultan Murad IV turned his gaze eastward. The city of Baghdad, the ancient capital of the Abbasid caliphs and a jewel of Mesopotamia, had been lost to the Safavid Shah Abbas the Great over a decade earlier. Its recapture was more than a strategic objective. It was a matter of imperial honor, a sacred duty for the Caliph of Islam. The architect of this monumental undertaking was Grand Vizier Tabaniasi Mehmed Pasha. A shrewd and ruthlessly efficient Albanian, he was one of the few men who held Murad's complete trust, a trust earned by competence and an unwavering loyalty born of a healthy fear. The Grand Vizier understood that wars were won not merely by soldiers, but by logistics. The campaign for Baghdad would be a colossal gamble. It meant marching an army of over 100,000 men, along with tens of thousands of support personnel and animals, across the vast, arid expanse of Anatolia and into the furnace of Mesopotamia. Supply lines had to be established and protected, stretching for more than 1,000 miles. Granaries were filled, roads repaired, and bridges built. An army of clerks and quartermasters worked relentlessly, their ink-stained fingers as vital to the war effort as the swords of the Janissaries. While the Grand Vizier managed the logistics, Murad provided the driving will. The Sultan was no distant sovereign sending his armies to fight. He was an active participant in the planning, poring over maps, interrogating scouts, and overseeing the casting of new, massive siege cannons. He made it known throughout the Divan that this was his personal mission. Failure would not be met with demotion, but with the executioner's sword. As the spring of 1635 approached, the final preparations were made. The great banners of the Sultan and the Prophet were unfurled. Istanbul buzzed with a nervous energy, a mixture of religious fervor and grim anticipation. The Grand Vizier had laid the groundwork for the greatest military operation in a generation. It was a monumental gamble, and the dice were about to be thrown. Before the Ottomans could strike at the heart of Safavid Mesopotamia, they first had to secure their northern flank. The target was the formidable fortress city of Revan, modern-day Yerevan, a critical Safavid stronghold in the Caucasus. In the summer of 1635, the imperial army, a sea of men and steel, marched out of Istanbul with Sultan Murad IV at its head. This was no ceremonial procession. Murad was every inch the warrior sultan, sharing the hardships of the march, sleeping in his tent and eating the same rations as his men. His presence was a constant source of motivation and dread. He was a commander who led from the front, his immense physical strength and martial prowess a living embodiment of the empire's power. The march was an ordeal, but upon reaching the plains before Revan, the true test began. The city was heavily fortified, its garrison commanded by the capable Tahmasp Kuli Khan. The Ottoman siege began with a thunderous artillery barrage. Great cannons, some firing stone balls the size of a man, pounded the city's thick walls day and night. Under the cover of this bombardment, elite Janissaries and sappers advanced, digging trenches and tunnels, inching closer to the walls in a deadly, subterranean war. The Safavid defense was fierce. They launched counterattacks, poured boiling oil on the attackers, and fought for every inch of ground. Murad was a whirlwind of activity, personally directing assaults, inspecting the siege lines, and even, according to some accounts, working a cannon himself. He demanded relentless pressure, giving the defenders no time to rest or repair their fortifications. After 11 days of brutal, unrelenting assault, a section of the main wall crumbled. The Janissaries poured through the breach, and the city fell in a storm of close-quarters combat. Murad rode triumphantly into the city he had conquered, not as a distant monarch, but as its chief conqueror. The Revan campaign was a stunning success. It was first blood, a demonstration of Murad's military genius and the resurrected might of the Ottoman army. But for the Sultan, the victory was merely a prelude. His eyes were already looking south, across the mountains and deserts, toward the ultimate prize, Baghdad. In the spring of 1638, the ground trembled under the weight of an empire on the move. This was not merely an army, it was the physical manifestation of a sultan's will. Murad IV, no longer the boy ruler overshadowed by his mother, was now the Iron Sultan, the Padishah whose gaze could freeze the blood of his own grand viziers. He had purged the Janissaries, restored order to the capital with a brutal hand, and now his eyes were fixed east on the jewel that had been stolen from the Sunni world, Baghdad. Leaving Constantinople was a spectacle of unparalleled grandeur and menace. The imperial standard, the Sanjak-i-Sharif, was unfurled, a sacred banner that had not been carried into battle by a sultan in person for generations. Tens of thousands of Janissaries, their disciplined ranks a stark contrast to their recent mutinous past, marched in grim silence. They were followed by the Sipahis, the elite cavalry, their polished armor gleaming under the Anatolian sun. Behind them rumbled the siege train, a terrifying collection of bronze and iron behemoths, cannons so large they required teams of oxen to drag them across the rugged terrain. This was Murad's declaration. The Revan campaign had been a success, but Baghdad was the true prize. It was a matter of imperial pride, religious duty, and strategic necessity. Every step the army took eastward was a message to Shah Safi of Persia. The time for games was over. The Sultan himself rode at the head of his men, not in a gilded carriage but on a powerful war horse. He shared their hardships, enduring the dust of the long roads and the cold of the mountain passes. He was a commander, not just a monarch, personally overseeing the logistics, the discipline, and the morale of his vast host. The march was a grueling odyssey, a testament to Ottoman organization and Murad's relentless drive. As they moved deeper into lands contested for centuries, the air grew thick with anticipation. This was more than a campaign. It was a crusade led by a sultan determined to carve his name into history with blood and steel. To understand the prize, one must understand its soul. Baghdad was not merely a city, it was a memory, a ghost of supreme glory. For 5 centuries it had been the heart of the Abbasid Caliphate, the epicenter of the Islamic Golden Age. Its libraries had held the knowledge of the ancient world. Its scholars had mapped the stars, and its poets had woven verses that still echoed in the courts of kings. It was the city of Harun al-Rashid, the city of 1,001 nights. Though its golden age had been shattered by the Mongol sack 4 centuries earlier, its name still resonated with unparalleled prestige. For the Ottomans, Sunni champions, its occupation by the Shia Safavids was an open wound, a constant, galling reminder of a challenge to their legitimacy as leaders of the Muslim world. The city itself, nestled in a fertile bend of the Tigris River, was a formidable fortress. Its defenses were a layered masterpiece of military architecture. A massive outer wall, thick enough for chariots to ride upon, was studded with imposing towers. Before this wall lay a deep, wide moat, a watery grave for any attacker who dared to approach. And behind this outer defense was an inner citadel, a final bastion of resistance. Within these walls lived a diverse and bustling population. But under Safavid rule, the Sunni majority had faced persecution, their mosques converted, their leaders silenced. The news of Murad's approach was a terrifying rumor for some, but for many, it was a whispered prayer for deliverance. The city was the linchpin of Mesopotamia, controlling the vital trade routes between the Persian Gulf and the Mediterranean. To hold Baghdad was to hold Iraq. For Shah Safi, it was a symbol of his dynasty's power and a critical buffer against Ottoman expansion. For Sultan Murad, its recapture was nothing less than the restoration of a sacred trust. It was a city worth any price, any sacrifice. As the Ottoman vanguard appeared on the horizon, the great walls of Baghdad stood silent, waiting to consume the lives of thousands. Inside the formidable walls of Baghdad, there was no panic, only a grim and hardened resolve. The city was under the command of Bektash Khan, a Georgian governor of renowned courage and loyalty to his master, Shah Safi. He had overseen the city's defenses for years, knowing this day would eventually come. When the first reports of Murad's colossal army arrived, he did not flinch. He sent riders to Isfahan, alerting the Shah, but his immediate actions were those of a seasoned commander preparing for a fight to the death. The city's granaries were full, its wells deep and clear. The armories were stocked with gunpowder, cannonballs, and thousands of arrows. Bektash Khan commanded a garrison of Persia's finest soldiers, the Qizilbash, warriors known for their fanatical bravery and skill with the shamshir. He walked the ramparts daily, his presence a calming influence on the troops. He inspected the cannons, conferred with his engineers, and ensured every section of the wall was manned by veterans. His orders were simple and absolute. Baghdad would not fall. From his capital in Isfahan, Shah Safi sent his reply. It was not a message of caution or negotiation, but one of defiance. He promised Bektash Khan reinforcements, though he knew they would likely be too late. The true message was implicit: hold at all costs. Bleed the Ottomans for every inch of ground. Make Murad pay a king's ransom in blood for this ambition. The Shah believed, perhaps arrogantly, that the city's legendary defenses, combined with the ferocity of his Qizilbash, could break the Sultan's will. They had held the city for 15 years, repelling previous attempts to reclaim it. Why should this time be different? The defenders looked out from their towers as the Ottoman host began to arrive, a sea of tents and men spreading across the plains. They saw the enemy's numbers, the endless lines of soldiers, the glint of sun on 100,000 spear points. Yet they felt a surge of pride, not fear. They were the guardians of a great Safavid prize, and they would sooner join their ancestors in paradise than surrender it to the Turkish Sultan. On November 15, 1638, the siege began. It did not start with a subtle probe or a cautious skirmish, but with a roar that shook the very foundations of the ancient city. Sultan Murad IV was not a man of patience. He ordered his grand batteries of siege cannons to open fire simultaneously. The air tore apart with the sound. Gigantic stone and iron balls, some weighing hundreds of pounds, smashed into Baghdad's outer walls. Towers that had stood for centuries crumbled into dust. The defenders, though prepared, were stunned by the sheer ferocity and scale of the bombardment. From dawn until dusk, the Ottoman guns never fell silent. The city was wreathed in a perpetual cloud of smoke and pulverized brick, the constant thunder of the cannons a torment to the ears and the soul. The Safavids answered with their own artillery from the walls, their gunners skilled and brave, but they were hopelessly outmatched. For every one cannonball they fired, the Ottomans returned 10. Murad was a constant, unnerving presence. He established his command post within clear sight of the walls, contemptuous of the danger. He personally directed the placement of batteries, studying the enemy defenses through a spyglass, identifying weaknesses with a predator's eye. He was seen riding along the trench lines, urging the Janissaries on, his expression a mask of cold fury. The first phase of the siege was a brutal, impersonal artillery duel. But soon the Ottoman sappers began their deadly work, digging zigzag trenches, known as parallels, that crept ever closer to the city's moat. Under the cover of cannon fire and darkness, they advanced meter by agonizing meter, enduring a hail of arrows, musket balls, and burning pitch from the defenders above. The Safavids launched daring night raids, pouring out of the city gates to sabotage the trenches and kill the sappers. Vicious hand-to-hand fighting erupted in the dark, a chaotic slaughter of sword, dagger, and desperation. Yet, for every trench destroyed, the Ottomans dug 2 more. The advance was inexorable, a slow, grinding constriction that was tightening around Baghdad's throat. The 40 days had begun. While the cannons thundered above, a second, more insidious war was being waged in the frozen earth beneath Baghdad. This was a conflict fought not with grand cavalry charges, but with pickaxes and shovels in the suffocating darkness. It was the domain of the Ottoman Lagumchular, the sappers, the masters of subterranean warfare. Day and night, these men, more moles than soldiers, clawed their way through the soil, their objective as simple as it was terrifying: to dig beneath the colossal towers and walls of Baghdad and pack the resulting galleries with barrels of gunpowder. Every foot of progress was a battle against collapsing earth, foul air, and the ever-present threat of discovery. The Safavid defenders were not idle. They listened intently, their ears pressed to the ground, trying to discern the faint rhythmic scraping of Ottoman tools. Their own sappers would dig countermines, hoping to intercept the Ottoman tunnels. What followed was a form of combat unique in its horror. Two tunnels would break into one another, and in a space barely wide enough for a man to crawl, soldiers would fight with daggers, pistols, and sharpened spades. There was no room for valor, only for brutal, claustrophobic survival. For the defenders on the walls, the psychological toll was immense. They lived with the constant, gnawing fear that the very ground beneath their feet could erupt at any moment, sending them and their fortifications hurtling into the sky. Every strange rumble, every tremor sent waves of panic along the ramparts. This secret war was a grim testament to the siege's totality. It was a slow, grinding, and nerve-shattering affair, where the fate of the city was being decided by unseen men, toiling in the silent, cold dark, their lives measured in inches of dirt and whispers of dynamite. Amidst the grand, impersonal machinery of the siege, a single death would irrevocably alter its course and harden the Sultan's heart. Grand Vizier Tayyar Mehmed Pasha was more than Murad IV's chief minister. He was a trusted friend, a companion in arms, and a steadying hand in the chaos of the campaign. He had been with Murad since the beginning, a veteran of the Revan campaign, and his presence at the Sultan's side was a source of both strategic counsel and personal comfort. On the 23rd of December, as the siege reached its grueling climax, the Grand Vizier was personally leading an assault, urging his men forward with a courage that bordered on recklessness. He was a visible target, a symbol of Ottoman resolve, and in the storm of lead and iron that swept the battlefield, fate found him. A Safavid cannonball tore through the air and struck him down. The news spread through the Ottoman camp like a shockwave, a sudden, chilling silence amidst the din of war. For Sultan Murad, the loss was profound and visceral. This was not the anonymous death of a soldier. It was the loss of a brother. The man who had shared his tent, his plans, and his burdens was gone. In his grief, a terrible transformation took place. The calculated strategist was consumed by a burning, personal rage. Baghdad was no longer merely a strategic prize. Its capture was now a matter of blood vengeance. Murad's sorrow curdled into an implacable fury. He immediately appointed a new Grand Vizier, but the emotional void left by Tayyar Mehmed Pasha was filled with a cold, unforgiving resolve. The price for his friend's life would be paid by the city, and the Sultan would see the debt collected in full, no matter how much blood had to be spilled to balance the ledger. The morning of Christmas Eve, 1638, dawned cold and brittle over the battered city. The weeks of subterranean warfare were about to bear their terrible fruit. Deep beneath the Naran Tower, one of the key defensive bastions, the Ottoman sappers had completed their work. The galleries were packed with an immense quantity of gunpowder, the fuses laid with meticulous care. The order was given. A deep, guttural roar shuddered through the earth, a man-made earthquake that ripped the very foundations of Baghdad asunder. The Naran Tower, a symbol of Safavid defiance for decades, seemed to lift into the air before disintegrating into a colossal cloud of dust, stone, and fire. A massive, gaping breach had been torn in the city's legendary defenses. For a moment, a stunned silence fell over the battlefield, broken only by the rain of debris. Then a new sound erupted, the deafening war cry of thousands of Janissaries. This was the moment they had bled and died for. With Murad IV himself observing from a forward position, they surged forward, a relentless tide of steel and fury pouring into the breach. The Safavid defenders, though shocked and decimated by the blast, reacted with desperate courage. They threw themselves into the gap, creating a wall of bodies to stem the Ottoman flood. The fighting in the breach was a maelstrom of primal violence. In the narrow, rubble-choked space, formations were meaningless. It was a chaotic, swirling melee of sword against scimitar, of men grappling hand to hand, fighting with a ferocity born of fanaticism and desperation. But the Ottoman numbers were overwhelming. For every Janissary that fell, 2 more scrambled over his body. Slowly, inexorably, they clawed their way through the breach, securing a foothold inside the city that would never be relinquished. The soul of Baghdad was now being contested, not on the walls, but in its very streets. The fall of the walls did not signal the end of the fighting. It marked the beginning of the city's agony. The Safavid commander, Bektash Khan, seeing the hopelessness of his situation, attempted to negotiate a surrender. But for Murad IV, still consumed by grief and rage over the death of his grand vizier, the time for negotiation was long past. While Bektash Khan was granted his life, his garrison was not. The Sultan's command was as simple as it was brutal: no quarter. The disciplined assault devolved into a city-wide slaughter. What followed was one of the most savage sacks of the era. The Ottoman soldiers, unleashed after a 40-day siege and embittered by their heavy losses, stormed through the streets and alleyways. The Safavid garrison fought to the last man in the narrow lanes, turning every house into a fortress and every square into a killing ground. But their resistance only fueled the fire of Ottoman wrath. For 3 days, Baghdad burned. The conquerors, driven by a lust for plunder and a thirst for vengeance, put the city to the sword. Historical accounts speak of tens of thousands slain, soldiers and civilians alike, caught in the indiscriminate storm of violence. The great libraries, repositories of centuries of knowledge, were put to the torch. Mosques and markets were looted and desecrated. Sultan Murad IV rode into the city he had coveted for so long, not as a liberator, but as an avenger. He toured the devastation, his face an impassive mask, witnessing the horrific price of his victory. This was the dark culmination of his ambition. Baghdad was once again an Ottoman city, but it was a city of ghosts, its streets slick with blood and its air thick with the smoke of its own funeral pyre. The conquest was complete, but it was a victory forever stained by the conqueror's wrath. The fires of Baghdad had cooled to embers, but the heat of a century of conflict between 2 empires still radiated from the scorched earth. Shah Safi of Persia, his armies shattered and his spirit broken by the loss of the sacred city, had no choice but to sue for peace. Sultan Murad IV, the conqueror, stood at the apex of his power, yet even he understood the brutal calculus of empire. His treasury was drained, his army exhausted, and the ghosts of the 40,000 dead in Baghdad's final siege haunted the victory. Perpetual war, even for a warrior sultan, was a path to ruin. In May 1639, envoys met at the frontier palace of Kasr-e-Shirin, a name that would soon be etched into the annals of history. The negotiations were not a debate between equals. They were the dictation of terms by a victor. The resulting agreement, the Treaty of Zuhab, was far more than a ceasefire. It was the final bloody punctuation mark on 150 years of sectarian warfare. The terms were stark and uncompromising. All of Mesopotamia, including the prize of Baghdad and the vital port of Basra, was to remain forever under the Ottoman crescent. The Safavids were forced to relinquish all claims. In return, the Ottomans ceded control of Yerevan and its surrounding territories in the Caucasus back to Persia. It was a pragmatic division of spheres of influence, a recognition of hard realities. But the treaty's most profound article was ideological. The Safavids had to agree to cease the ritual cursing of the first 3 caliphs, a core practice of state-sponsored Shi'ism that the Sunni Ottomans considered blasphemy. This was Murad's spiritual victory, a forced submission on a theological level. This treaty, signed in the shadow of immense slaughter, would prove to be one of the most durable in history. With minor adjustments, the border it drew in the Zagros Mountains remains the frontier between modern-day Turkey, Iraq, and Iran. It was a border drawn not with ink, but with the blood of countless thousands, a lasting monument to Murad's savage and absolute will. The journey back to Istanbul was a long, triumphant procession. From Diyarbakir to the capital, Sultan Murad IV was hailed as a living legend, the Ghazi who had restored the honor of the House of Osman. He was the new Alexander, the conqueror of Baghdad, the man who had single-handedly dragged the empire back from the brink of collapse. The celebrations in Istanbul were the grandest the city had seen in a generation. Parades of captured Persian standards, displays of military might, and the adoring roar of the crowd filled the streets. Murad sat astride his warhorse, an imposing, colossal figure, the very embodiment of imperial power. He had achieved everything he had ever desired. He had avenged the failures of his predecessors, crushed his enemies both foreign and domestic, and secured his borders. He was the undisputed, absolute master of his world, and he was utterly, profoundly alone. The victory felt hollow, the adulation like a distant echo. The campaign had taken more than just his enemies. It had taken the last vestiges of his trust. His childhood friend and Grand Vizier, Tayyar Mehmed Pasha, lay buried outside the walls of Baghdad, a casualty of the first day's assault. Countless other pashas and commanders had fallen, either to Persian swords or to Murad's own executioners. Who was left to share this triumph? Who could possibly understand the weight of the decisions he had made, the horrors he had witnessed and authored? In the cavernous halls of the Topkapi Palace, the cheers of the city faded, replaced by a suffocating silence. He had found his purpose in the singular, clarifying focus of war. The campaign, the siege, the fight, these were things he understood. But peace was a void. He had climbed the highest mountain of his ambition only to find its peak cold, barren, and solitary. The crown he wore was no longer a symbol of power, but a heavy, gilded cage, isolating him in a victory that offered no comfort. The conqueror of Baghdad could defeat armies, but he could not defeat the enemy within his own body. The immense physical strength that had allowed Murad to wield a 60-kilogram mace was failing him. Years of relentless campaigning, coupled with legendary consumption of wine and spirits, had taken their toll. Cirrhosis of the liver and excruciating gout racked his giant frame, transforming the fearsome sultan into a prisoner of his own chambers. The iron will remained, but it was trapped inside a decaying vessel. As his body weakened, his mind, always prone to suspicion, curdled into paranoia. He saw plots in every shadow and traitors in every corner. The man who had restored order to the empire was now a source of terror within his own palace, his rages as unpredictable and deadly as they had been on the battlefield. In the winter of 1640, as death's shadow grew longer, Murad became obsessed with a single, terrifying thought: his legacy. He had rebuilt the state through bloodshed and iron discipline. The thought that it would all crumble after his death tormented him, and the source of this potential ruin, in his fevered mind, was his only surviving brother, Ibrahim. Ibrahim had spent nearly his entire life in the cafes, the gilded cage within the palace, a prince living under constant threat of execution. This existence had left him mentally unstable, wholly unprepared for the burdens of rule. Murad saw him not as a brother, but as a fatal flaw in the imperial line, and so, from his deathbed, the Sultan gave his final, most chilling order. Ibrahim was to be executed. He would rather the Ottoman dynasty die with him than see his life's work undone by a madman. The order was absolute. But this time, his command was met not with obedience, but with deception. His powerful mother, Kösem Sultan, conspired with the Grand Vizier. They knew the empire needed an heir, no matter how flawed. As Murad lay dying, they told him the execution had been carried out. The ultimate autocrat, whose word had been life and death for millions, drew his last breath believing a lie, his final act of control thwarted by the very people sworn to obey him. On the 8th of February, 1640, Sultan Murad IV, the scourge of God and the restorer of the state, died at the age of 27. He passed from the world believing he was the last of his line, having ordered the death of his only brother. Moments after his death, the palace doors were unsealed. Officials rushed to the cafes, the prince's cage, to bring forth the man Murad had deemed unfit to exist, let alone rule. They found a terrified Ibrahim, convinced they were the executioners his brother had promised. It took the presentation of Murad's corpse to convince him that he was not being led to his death, but to the throne of the world's most powerful empire. Thus began the reign of Ibrahim the Mad, and the final judgment on Murad's legacy commenced. How is such a man to be remembered? He was undeniably a tyrant. His reign was a river of blood, with estimates of his executions running into the tens of thousands. He ruled through terror, his spies were everywhere, and his punishments were swift and brutal. He was a monster of rage and suspicion, a man who could kill for the slightest infraction. Yet this same man inherited a state on the verge of utter disintegration. The treasury was empty, the provinces in open revolt, and the Janissaries and Sipahis were the de facto rulers of Istanbul, murdering sultans and viziers at will. With breathtaking ruthlessness, Murad reversed it all. He broke the power of the mutinous soldiery, purged corrupt officials, refilled the state coffers, and led his armies to a victory that had eluded his predecessors for decades. The Treaty of Zuhab, his crowning achievement, secured a peace on the eastern frontier that would last for nearly a century. He was the last of the great Ottoman warrior sultans, a throwback to an earlier, more savage era of conquest and consolidation. Was his cruelty a necessary evil to cauterize the wounds of a dying empire? Or was he simply a man consumed by the intoxicating poison of absolute power? The truth, as always, is complex and uncomfortable. Murad IV left behind an empire that was stable, solvent, and feared. He also left a legacy of terror and a chilling reminder that order, when forged in blood, is a fragile and terrible thing.